Very quick introduction to you all. My name is Karthik Ramachandran. Previously I was a BCG project leader in the Dallas office. Joined as an associate post undergrad, and went to business school at Wharton. Came back to BCG, was an interviewer for BCG, and was also a case prep lead at both my undergrad, which was the McCombs School of Business, and then at Wharton as well. And so happy to chat about anything about consulting, the interview process, consulting, best practices, day in the life of a consultant. Honestly, I'm very much an open book and just want to be as helpful as possible. And so maybe we'll start right now. Yeah, perfect. Thank you, Natalie, for the question. So I'll start up with that. And then if anyone has any questions, please continue to put those in the chat. Okay, so the first question is, what tools do you recommend for firming up your mental math? This is my number one worry when practicing casing. Thanks in advance. Okay, great. So I think the biggest thing with consulting math is it's not really about just how fast can you do math. It's a lot about, can you structure an equation to a business problem, right? And so an example of something that tests that is, if we currently have a 40% market share, and in order for us to want to be in a segment, we need to at least be at a revenue share of 250 million. Like, what is the max share we can lose per year over the next 5 years? Like, that's the kind of question where it's as much about translating that business context into an equation as it is actually crunching. In terms of tools, I think there's a couple different pieces that you can do. I've in the past, used rocket blocks. I think that Victor Sheng had a case math set of drills as well. I've found that those math drills are actually usually quite helpful, and they do a good job of kind of testing the types of computations you do. And then another way I actually used to do it is I would make case questions, or like think of hypotheticals of like, oh, what is the market share we would have to take, and how much profit margin could we give up in order to maintain X amount of profitability? And I would just create a question like that and then structure it into an equation and then plug in numbers and try to work on it. I know it sounds probably simpler than it is, but I'd say that's probably the best set of tools I can think through is finding some kind of a drill based platform, as well as of course, right, like using Leland plus content that is focused on math and math structuring as well. So I think all of those are really great ways to go about it. Great. Thank you, Matthew, for the question, which is, as an interviewer at BCG, what are the main characteristics you see and look for in candidates for consulting positions? It's a great question. Okay, so I think there's a few different things. I think the first thing is curiosity, and curiosity in terms of being jazzed to actually like solve business problems, especially ambiguous ones. And so the excitement factor is like really important, actually, I'd say a structured approach. So even if you aren't familiar with an industry, if you're asked to, I don't know, size the number of bowling alleys in the United States, you might not know anything about bowling, but are you able to kind of break it down into some kind of underlying behavior? Are you able to segment into the different kinds of people that might be, going to bowling alleys, what their frequency is, what the demand looks like, and be able to put a structure together? I'd say the other thing is, and this is not a formalized thing, but I think consulting firms love to find people that I think are dual hatted. And what I mean by that is, everybody is probably leans one direction or another in terms of either being, let's say, more quantitatively minded or like more kind of qualitatively minded, but they want someone who is well-rounded enough to kind of be able to do them both. And so I always joke, right, that the ideal consulting candidates are either a software engineer who likes to write poetry or a liberal arts major who tries to build Excel models to optimize airline points on the side, right? The kind of dual hats that you'd think about of being both right side brained as well as left side brained. And so I'd say those are the major characteristics they're looking for. And then the final one is just basically a likability test of you've probably heard the airport test of would they be able to spend 10 hours like stuck with you, and would it be an enjoyable amount of time to be spent? So I'd say those are really the major characteristics. All right, I see 3 questions from Liza here, and apologies if I pronounced that wrong. Number 1, for MBA interviews, what is the likelihood that you get an unusual case, market sizing, for example? I think on that question, actually, market sizing, depending on the firm, may or may not be that unusual, right? Like, I think that, for example, Bain has had a long run history of like using market sizing cases at, I wouldn't say like super frequently necessarily, but like at least to a decent extent. And so I'd say it's somewhat firm specific. I'd say the most typical kind of case you're going to run into is profit oriented cases of some kind. It's pretty rare for a case to not have any profit component to it, but you know, um, by likelihood, I would say prepare based upon the fact that you are solving a set of ambiguous problems, rather than trying to like memorize frameworks for profitability or memorize frameworks for market entry. And if you really kind of understand the logic of creating, MECE buckets and asking the right questions within those buckets, I think that you'll be well prepared regardless of what kind of case you get. So, second question for interviewers that really interviewees, I'm assuming, that really impressed you. What did they do differently than others, both on behavioral and the case? I think the biggest thing is just being razor structured on the way they approach problems. Like the pieces that they present are all very logical buckets, but on top of that, they don't stay generic. They get more detailed. They get into in the behavioral case, they get into the why behind why they acted. In the case side, it's the what are the underlying sub drivers within a set of buckets? What are the questions we would need to answer it? And then most importantly, right, where do we want to focus our time and what needs to be on the back burner? And then I see a question on what does the deliberation look like after a final round interview? How much is weighed across the final interviews versus the chatbot, other interactions, so on. Okay, so the chatbot, very much has like the is kind of a screener. I'd say a screener interview to try to determine first rounds, and then the first round interview, essentially the two interviewers both have a rubric that they score you on, and it's a variety of different things that they're looking for, whether it's presence, whether it's case structuring, whether it's analytical aptitude, ability to synthesize, and these are things that they'll give you like numerical scores, and those rubrics kind of are continuously updated by BCG and other firms, and then there's essentially the hiring team will have like a set of discussions on the candidates that are being evaluated, and then make the decision with the inputs from the interviewers. And so the actual interview, I mean, the chatbot I very much look at as a screener. Things like the coffee chats, other interactions are, I'd say, a get the foot in the door kind of a thing, with the actual case interview being heavily determinant on whether you get an offer or not. All right, I see questions from Stanley of I applied for a BCG position in 23 and 24, supported by 2 referrals. Although I passed the online case, I haven't received an interview invite. Question of, does this indicate my current profile aren't sufficient? Should I continue to pursue this office? Is it better to stop applying? It is definitely, I'd say, a very personal question, and I'm happy to kind of chat offline in an intro call or something along those lines. But high level, what I'd say is, an endorsement from a referral typically helps, get the foot in the door and get the resume in front of the recruiter so that they look at it seriously. Now, that being said, the interview invite thing, it could be a whole host of factors. It could be something on your resume structurally that's like preventing an interview. It could be something where, for specific kinds of, offices, there's more capacity versus less capacity, that kind of a thing. I would say like you don't have to kind of think about it as like better to just stop applying. I think if there's any way the referral individuals can follow up on your front and try to like see if they can get any additional insight, that's helpful. But I would have to, talk more directly with you just to learn more about your profile to see, what maybe our best path forward on something like that could be. So highly recommend you, booking an intro call, and then we can, go from there. Can you give some tips on case structuring? So I always say, right, you'll probably hear from a bunch of trainers, coaches, everything, that like you want your structure to be MECE, which is mutually exclusive and collectively exhaustive. And in plain English, I kind of look at it in a couple ways, which is you want the high level buckets that you're using to solve the problem to together solve all aspects that you can think of the problem. But you also don't want to be double solving things. So you want the areas that you're exploring to be somewhat distinct from each other. So that's what MECE essentially is. And I think a very structured individual is able to kind of use what I call an opposites approach at the highest level of a framework. So that can be something like, financial or non-financial, or if there's a case with a time element to it, long-term or short-term. And these are very generic, right? And the key to then being really good is you have those opposite elements stacked upon each other to create sub-buckets at the highest point, but then you're able to tailor the sub-buckets with specific questions that are targeted at the case question in mind. So if you have a case that's really not focused on the long-term, having a short-term, long-term bucket is not tailored to the case, right? So having other sets of buckets is important. But if it's a case that, let's say, has a short-term, long-term aspect, and it's an R&D case, right? You might talk a lot about the upfront investments from a patent standpoint, from a production standpoint needed in the short run, and then long run talk about how those would go away, right? And that would be a way that you tailor your framework to the case at hand. And so the really successful people find a way to have those opposite buckets in a very, very effective, structured, distinct way at the top, but then take away the genericism by fleshing it out at the bottom. All right. I get a question of, can you get a referral from a consultant in a different office than the one you're applying to? I think you can. I will say that like offices and regions tend to do recruiting very, very distinctly from each other sometimes. The best bet that you can have, especially since like oftentimes the consultants are in very good contact with the hiring team, the HR teams of the local offices, the best way is to have a consultant from that system try to let you in. And so, what I would say is a really good practice is if you personally know someone in one office but you're applying to a different office, I would try to ask that consultant to see if they're able to kind of set up maybe a coffee chat with some other individual from the system that you're actually applying to. And then from there, make a good impression on that second connection, talk through your story, and then ask if there's a way that they can help you kind of get your resume in front of the recruiter. That's probably the best way I would go about it. Awesome. So then Natalie says, how would you advise an experienced hire who's non-MBA to thoughtfully approach the managed consulting recruiting process? Great. So the biggest benefit of like, let's say if you were at an MBA program is that the consulting firms come to you, right? So you don't really have to kind of get a McKinsey or a BCG's attention. Like they're coming to campus and they're having events and so on. I would say the best way to get your foot in as an experienced hire is try to find alums from your company that are now at that consulting firm and set up a coffee chat, right? Like I'm using just an example here. If you worked in oil and gas at Chevron and you find some people in the Houston office of McKinsey or BCG that used to be petroleum engineers at Chevron and then now are working in the Houston office, that's a perfect person to reach out, say, hey, currently at Chevron, I saw you have work experience at Chevron, want to learn more about how to actually make a transition into consulting, and then that person can be an advocate for you. And then from there also ask them how they went about preparing for things. I would say a really thoughtful way to approach it is to think about what areas you need to fill gaps in based upon your current set of strengths and experience. And what do I mean by that? So if you were, let's say, a PhD in statistics, like I'm pretty sure the math aspect of consulting cases is not gonna stress you out much. But finding a coach who can help you like learn how to structure like frameworks, how to ask thoughtful clarifying questions, how to synthesize a case, that might be more of your focus. Let's say you were a liberal arts major and like maybe you were a nationally competitive debater. I would probably expect that your ability to synthesize, your ability to be articulate is actually very good, but you may have less experience with like translating business questions into math equations and like learning how to do sensitivity analyses. So then hiring a coach to really help you with targeted drills on the quant side of things might be your best bet of investing time. And so I'd say from an experienced hire background, first like know that like consulting firms, in my mind at least, are moving more and more to a specialist model. So they're actively looking for experienced hires that bring specific industry experience. Second, once you find a mentor that has blazed the route that you're looking to follow, that's the best way to get your foot in the door. And then finally, just having a critical eye on what you want to work on from a strength and a weakness standpoint is really important. Okay, I see. I think it's Tuba asked, why did you leave BCG? Great, it's a really great question. I'll first say that BCG is probably, I mean, to this date was the single best professional choice I made, which was coming out of undergrad. I mean, I didn't, I was someone who was had a lot of energy, was really excited to solve problems, but I didn't have any actual industry experience. And being able to rotate every 2 to 3 months across cases, across functions, across industries, and working with a set of like very, very intelligent but like humble peers, there's really nothing like it from a learning standpoint. I mean, I learned in my, let's call it like 6-ish years in consulting, like far more than I think a lot of people might learn in like a decade plus in an industry role that's like more of the same, I'd say, day to day. And so that's a big positive consulting. And consulting firms really take care of their own, right? Like whether it's, in my case, BCG paid for my MBA. BCG like had great trainings, like great mentorship. And even when I was looking to leave, like there was so much support in terms of people willing to make connections to alumni that were in different companies and the such. Ultimately, the reason why I left BCG was, my wife and I, we had been married for a few years. I was traveling a decent amount for my job, and I think it's very hard as a consultant to completely avoid travel. And I was looking for something I'd say a little bit more stable, something where I was able to kind of go into an office locally, come back home, and also not be working too many hours in the evenings. And that was really what I was looking for. My wife and I were looking to have a kid shortly thereafter, and for us, it was the right thing for our family for me to leave at that point. But the beauty of leaving BCG at like the project leader level was it really kind of accelerated the exit opportunity I could get, right? And so my exit opportunity was essentially a director of finance role at JCPenney, where I was a direct report to the CFO. And if I think about, I can't really think of any other job where 6 years of work experience would have gotten me a direct report to the CFO role at a company with over $5 billion in revenue, right? Just amazing opportunity. And it turns out that actually the guy who got me that role was chief strategy officer at JCPenney, and he was a ex consulting partner at BCG that I knew. And so he was the guy who put in my referral to the CFO. I got to chat with the CFO and then got hired from there. And then lo and behold, a year and a half later, the CFO ended up leaving the company, and that chief strategy officer, who's my personal connection, became my boss as CFO. And so that tells you how small these consulting worlds are and how much benefit there is from being an alum, even when you decide to leave, which is great. Kamal says, "Can we practice casing with consultants at the office we're applying to? Is it allowed?" Typically, once you're in the process, the consulting firms will identify a case buddy that is within the office that is volunteered to do practice cases. Beyond that, like they probably aren't able to kind of do too many more of those, and that's just because like they don't want to give an unfair advantage to anyone or not. And so that's why, right? I think that like right coaches like me exist, right? And why Leland has so many great coaches is we're all ex consulting folks that have thought critically about how best to coach people for the process, and we no longer kind of have the conflict of interest where we're within the firms per se. And so that's really your best source of getting, I'd say, a lot of good quality feedback and good quality repetitions at doing it. So great. So I see. How do you approach the brainstorming section of case interviews? What is a good way to practice? So I always say a good way to think about brainstorming is just as you're going to use a framework or a structure to answer an overall case question, you want to make sure you have kind of areas or structured buckets that are meaty to answer brainstorming as well. Now, it's never going to be as deep as a case interview, like as a case interview framework. So a case framework, you might have 3 layers of opposite buckets and like 8 buckets underneath, right? That come from nesting those opposites on top of each other. In brainstorming, it might just be something as simple as I'm going to look at this from a immediate standpoint and a long-term standpoint, just like 2 areas, and then having ideas within that. I'd say start building yourself in the habit of still using like a couple buckets up top, or maybe 3 to 4 buckets, not like necessarily the 3 layers of it. And that's the best way to really approach brainstorming. Ultimately, one thing I'll kind of say is like consultants are not like Mozarts and like artists. Like we're not people that I'd say are like the hyper creatives that are just intuitive. Like usually consulting creative ideas come from using a structured approach to generating ideas, right? And so that's the best way I would say it. And like a really great way to practice brainstorming is finding a coach that can help you identify the kinds of cases that require you to do that kind of brainstorming. And so that's like honestly one of the biggest value adds of a coach is depending upon what you want to work on, finding the right kinds of cases that'll give you the kind of practice you need. So I'd say that's a really, really important thing. And then let me see here. So Matthew Walsh says, can you go into the typical day of your time at BCG? How often were you traveling? It's a really good question. So it's very case to case, I would say. But that being said, a typical day would go something like this. You'd wake up. I would maybe wake up around like 7 a.m., get ready, go into the client site or local office around 8. In the morning would probably have a couple hours of structured like working time. And that could be a whole host of things, right? If you're early on in the case, oftentimes that can be, like touch bases or meetings with like clients to learn more about the client context. Sometimes it can be brainstorming sessions with your internal team. Sometimes if it's like a very clear case scope, but you have internal experts, like you'll try to set up calls with internal experts at the firm to really, really understand, what's going on that front. Then usually there is, some time to create content. You'll either be like making some slides or some potential outputs that you think could eventually go into the end deliverables for the clients. And then there's usually, once a week or so case team meetings where all the different work streams that are working together will share what they're working on with each other, get feedback from partners, get feedback from other colleagues and the such. There will typically be client working sessions you'll do in the afternoons as well. Sometimes, people will take like anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour for a lunch break as well. Um, and then kind of more time in the evening where you're either doing, or in the afternoon where you're doing either analysis or, putting together storylines. With the idea that, usually I was leaving the client site, let's call it anywhere from like 6 to 6:30 or so. I would get on the road, get back to the hotel, go, for a quick workout, get dinner, and then probably work for a couple hours in the evening. I usually try to, keep it sustainable by, signing off anywhere from 10 to 10:30 in the at PM in the evenings. And then, that would allow me to get like a good 8 hours sleep at night and then kind of start back in the mornings. And then the really good thing at BCG, at least, was we generally were like weekends were considered sacred. So I was never really working on weekends. I can probably count on one hand how many weekends I worked. And so that was really, I'd say, the typical day in the life of BCG. In terms of how often I was traveling, I'd say maybe like about three-fourths of my cases were travel cases. And when I started at BCG as an associate, this was back in 2015, we were usually doing 4 days on client site every single week. It started becoming more like 2 to 3 days on client site, like I'd say in the post-COVID timeframe. Where, of course, like during COVID, there was a time frame where everything was remote. But I honestly thought that was like the worst way to do consulting because you get so much learning from being in person with folks. And so when I was leaving BCG, it was more like people would usually leave maybe Monday evening or Tuesday morning and then get to the client site and then leave Thursday evening. And then Friday would be working back in the home office. And typically it's a lighter day. You're maybe working from 8 a.m. to like 4 p.m. or 5 p.m. rather than like a full day, right? So I always say, right, like consulting would average something in the range of 60, maybe 60-ish hours is probably the average of the bad case, going 65 to 70 hours a week. And that 60 hours is typically like, I'd say 4 13-ish hour days from Monday to Thursday with like an 8-ish hour day on Friday. And then your weekend being more or less free for you completely. So great. And then what would you say my chances are with a 3.0 out of 4 GPA? Kamal asks. So Kamal, I'd say that like, if you're applying to be an associate, I would say it's like typically the GPA bar is usually, I'd say, in the 3.7, 3.8 range. Now, that being said, it's a very much a, what's the, what's your personal context, right? And that's where I think we absolutely can have an intro call to chat through that. I always tell people, right, if undergrad GPA is something of a concern to try to get interviews at the undergrad level, there are a lot of entry points into consulting. It could be via working in another industry, building some industry experience, and then either doing like an MBA or a master's degree of some kind, and then trying to enter through that and focusing on getting a better GPA in that graduate school. It could be after building really strong expertise. I'm talking like 6, 7, 8 years, trying to lateral at the manager level. Even where like your GPA plays less of a role, that's a possibility too. But really, I think there's a lot of personal context that is required to kind of make a really good case for the path forward. But I would say, right, with a 3, I mean, it is going to be harder to get an interview at the undergrad level. I see a question which is, what would be your advice for a case interview where you are feeling lost? How can I prevent myself from getting discouraged and get back on track? So it's a really good question. I'd say the most prepared people are the kinds of people that genuinely enjoy doing case interviews. You're not afraid of them. You're not looking at them as like some kind of a way to like get you down. You're looking at them as a cool opportunity to solve a puzzle that's like a pretty interesting exercise. And so then if you take that mindset, then when you're in a case which is completely unfamiliar, you're starting to get sidetracked on, you really like kind of center yourself, take a deep breath. You're like, okay, what are the first principles I'm trying to solve for here? And maybe that requires backtracking a little bit and just saying, hold on, I'm going to like take a step back. And that's a very reasonable thing to do in an interview, is like, if you feel like you're not making like a good kind of path forward. I've in an interview before, I told my interviewer, do you mind if I take just a quick step back? I just want to make sure I'm reevaluating the approach, and then kind of taking a second and then going forward and trying to resetting myself before setting out the path forward again. I'd say some of it is like, really, really understanding that as much as possible, they're not looking for reasons to reject you. They're looking for reasons to accept you. And once you internalize that psychology, it makes it a lot more enjoyable of a process. Like they're looking for talented people with the idea that if you're not perfectly performing at everything, if you have small holes here and there, there are ways consulting firms can help address those things once you're within the firm. But they love to bring in someone that has a very clear spike, a very clear talent, whether that's, wow, like this person has just a great approach to structuring problems, or this person is great at just, really breaking down analytically the core of a problem, or this person is really articulate, would have great presence with a client. Like they're looking for reasons to accept you. And so, when you kind of take that mindset, I'd say it really helps you stay more encouraged and keeping your chin up even when the case gets hard. So great. I know it's 12:29. We can definitely take a couple more questions as well. Can everyone see my PowerPoint page with the link as well as the discount code? If anyone can just say yes, that would be great. Just to make sure it's visible. Perfect. Great. And so then I see another question here, which is, do you have any tips for the fit questions? Right. So you've probably heard about like a good way to generally answer behavioral questions, which is the STAR method of situation, task, like the actions you took, and the result. I always say that like people don't tell you kind of what a really good way to allocate time within STAR is. And in my mind, right, your situation and task, you want it to be really, really punchy in terms of how you like detail that out. So like don't spend too much time on your situation, don't spend too much time on the task, but it should be clear what the context was. And then really focus on the actions you took, the psychology you had behind the actions you took, the challenges you might have faced, the such, and then the end result and being able to quantify wherever you can. I always say the best fit questions are where a candidate has not just like memorized a bunch of answers, but like knows the high level talking points. But when they present it, really focus that time on that action and that result. And that's absolutely an area where I think a coach can help as well. A coach typically, once they're able to kind of hear your different answers to different kinds of questions, whether it's, let's say, a time that you navigated a conflict or a time that you worked with stakeholders, can kind of tell you, hey, like, as you were kind of building out the context, you spent a little too much time on the client context and what the issues were, when I would have liked to hear more about what you personally did to manage that client relationship. Like that's the kind of feedback you'll get when you work with a coach that's kind of a neutral third party to help kind of assess the way that you present your experiences. Great. Well, great. I'll take a quick second, just first thank you all for coming, and then also just make a plug for. I know like a lot of people are going through different recruiting cycles or like kicking off recruiting cycles. I always like love to build a longer term relationship with clients. And for me, right, coaching is a way to build trajectory. It's to build kind of consistent, strong progress. And I always liken it to if you want to go to the gym and you want to start working out and you get a personal trainer, no one ever books them for one session and just ends at that. You want to kind of build something regular, build a routine, build somebody who's like invested in your progress. And so with that in mind, I really, really would love to work with any of you on packages of prep sessions. And we can use those for case preparation, which is what most people use them for. We can use them for behavioral fit questions. We can even use them for targeted drill sessions. So after a few cases, if we figure out, look, like we really need to focus on frameworking, things are good on the math front and so on. I actually am happy to do, drills that are focused very specifically on case prepping or on structuring as well. And so, happy to do intro calls with any of you to try to see if it makes sense for us to work together. And through the end of December, if you use this code Karthik-R-AMA, you can get a 10% discount off any of my packages. I have sessions of packages for sessions of 5, 10, 20, and 30 sessions. And all of those actually have baked in volume discounts that escalate as you book more sessions. And using the code, you'd get 10% off on top of that. And so definitely use that code before the end of December, and hope to work with some of you guys.